Welcome to AFrame Lesson 2.7. In this video, we're going to cover doing animations that alternate between two different states, such as bouncing from left to right, top to bottom, possibly growing and shrinking, or fading in and out. So let's get to it. So just to orient you a little bit to our world here, so we've created a bunch of classes to represent simple objects, but again, it's just nicer to encapsulate everything in a class instead of working it directly in our script file. So you have a box, a cone, a sphere, and a tortoise. And we're going to animate all of these in such a way that they alternate between two different states. We're going to focus primarily on the box, and then we'll kind of explore this same technique as it was applied to the cone, the sphere, and the tortoise. Going into our script, we have our basic Windows onload to get everything started. We have our recursive loop for the animation. And let's go ahead and create a box at a particular location. So let's say new box. Let's say 0, 1, and a -5. All right, so the box is in the world. Nothing's happening with the box because we haven't actually added any animation code to it. So going over to our box class, we can see here we have a constructor that accepts the x, y, and z and assigns it to the class variables. We create the box element, we position it, and then we append it to the scene. Now we have this update function, which is meant to create the animation. So let's just do a little review of animation. So the idea behind animation is that you slowly increase some aspect of the component and then update that particular attribute. So I'm actually going to copy and paste that here. So as you can see here, we're updating the x position by 0.01, and then we're updating its position. Going over to our script now, in our recursive loop, we can say box.update to kind of execute that code we just entered in. And what that does is that the box slowly moves off to the right, and it will never come back. And that's the purpose of this lesson, is how to alternate between different states. In this case, we're going to alternate between right and left. So the first thing we have to realize is that if we want the box to come back, this value has to change. Instead of adding 0.01, we have to now subtract it. But we're not going to think of it as subtracting. We're going to think of it as adding a negative number. So to accomplish this, we're going to add another variable called dx, a change in x. And we'll set that variable up to this value. And we'll modify this to be this.dx. And just to prove to you that nothing's really changed here, we just created another variable with the same values we had before. So it's still moving to the right. So now what we need to do is we need to change that value of this.x. So we're going to do that with an if statement. So we're going to say if this.x. So if the box reaches a certain point, let's say maybe greater than or equal to 2, what we want to do is we want to reverse that value. So we want to make this.x the opposite of what it was. Now, because these are numbers, I can simply put a negative sign in it. And just to kind of prove to you that that's what's actually happening, I'm going to do a console log to show you that the value of this.x has now been changed, in addition to actually changing it. So let's run it again. And you can see here now the value became negative 0.01, which means it's now subtracting and going to the left. And now we have a similar situation where it's going to go to the left and it's never going to come back. So what we can do with this if statement, because we have a similar situation, we want to switch the value of dx again. But now we want to do it when this.x becomes some low value. So let's say a -2 in this case. And let's go ahead and increase this a little bit so it bounces back and forth a little bit more. Now, if you look at the console, notice how that value is fluctuating between the positive and negative. That's what's allowing it to bounce back and forth. Now, you can do the same things with, the Y values to make it bounce up and down, and so on. I'll leave that as an exercise for you to try out. But this technique of taking some attribute, some property, and then changing it by some amount, and then using an if statement to change between those two values is how you create this idea of alternating states. So let's go ahead and explore some of these other ones as we kind of go through it. So let's look at the cone. So in this particular case, what we're going to do is we're going to change the height of the cone. So you can see here it starts off at 1, and then it's going to slowly increase by 0.01. Using that same technique of the if statement, you'll see that when it gets bigger than 3 or it gets smaller than 4, we're simply going to change the rate, that delta of the height, to the opposite. So that way it grows, it increases and decreases. So let's add the cone and see how that looks. So let's say cone is equal to new cone. And let's see, where should we put it? Let's put it a little bit more in front. So we're going to keep it in the same spot, just closer to us though. Let's say -2. Hopefully that's not too much. And just to start off, you can see there's the cone, so maybe we'll move it back a little bit more. And it's not animating because we didn't put the code inside the recursive loop. So let's say cone.update inside the loop. And you can see here now the cone is growing and shrinking. Why? Because we're constantly updating the height by the change in height. That's what the d height represents. Again, these are just variables. This is just my own convention that when I use this technique, I'll precede whatever the property is with the d to let me know that that's the change in the height. And then whenever it reaches our two limits, we simply change the rate at what it changes. So it's either going positive, increasing, or decreasing. All right, so let's take a look at another one. Let's look at the sphere. And for the sphere, again, it seems to be like I like this number of 0.01. So we're going to change the opacity. Now what the opacity does is that it lets you change how transparent an object is. And again, look at that same structure. Take the property, update it by its change in that property, whatever you decide to do, and then look at the two limits. So whenever it gets to below 0, which means it's completely transparent, or above 1, which means it's solid, I change the rate of the opacity, which again, it either means that I'm increasing the opacity or decreasing the opacity. So let's add that to our world, and what's that? The sphere equals new sphere. And let's put it at 0. Let's raise it up some. Let's say 3. And we'll put it at -6. So it's a little bit further behind everything else. Same thing. Let's not forget to add it to our recursive loop so it actually updates. And let's see what that fading in and out looks like. So, different properties, different effects, but same technique. The idea of updating the property by some delta and then simply setting that attribute as part of our update function for that particular object. So let's take a look at one more, the tortoise. And the tortoise has an interesting attribute that allows us to change the arc, which is how much of that donut do we actually see. So you'll see here we start off with 0, and then we increase the angle of how much we see of that donut, think of it like a circle, by 1. Here's the increase of the arc by the delta arc. And then when it reaches 0, below 0, or if it's above 270, not the full circle, we simply change the rate of how the arc is growing. So let's add that to our script. So tortoise equals new tortoise, and let's say 0, 4, -6. And let's update the tortoise. Let's see what that looks like. All right, so I actually wanted to try, let's try this. Let's try to do -1 on that one. All right, so again, just an interesting combination of effects here. So by putting the tortoise here, it almost looks like it's on top of the sphere. And as it grows, it looks like eventually it connects back to the circle. Again, this can be applied to any attribute, which is simply, picking an attribute, doing it by some change, and then using this technique of the if statement to change the value of that delta depending on whatever attribute it is. So let's go back to our presentation and review what we've done. So in this video, we saw we can alternate an animation between two different states. For instance, with, I believe it was the box, we made it bounce from left to right. You could also do the same thing with the Y, making it go up and down. So if you want to mimic somewhat of a jump, you can use that technique. We could grow and shrink, fade in and out. You could do this with any attribute. So it's about having that delta that then gets switched with a simple if statement, checking both sides of the limits of your animation. So I highly encourage you to try this out with different animations and enjoy.